The Nexus Supreme Court had witnessed many peculiar defendants over its 12,000-year history, but never one who brought her own service to a capital trial. Professor Elena Vasquez sat in the crystalline defendant's chair, methodically preparing loose-leaf Earl Grey while the galaxy's most prestigious legal minds debated whether her actions constituted treason or evolution. The prosecution will now present opening arguments, announced Chief Adjudicator Kethmore, whose species had evolved from creatures that resembled a cross between a praying mantis and a filing cabinet. Perfect for legal work, really. Prosecutor Hive Unit 779 rose from their collective seating arrangement, 12 identical bodies moving in perfect synchronization. When they spoke, their voices harmonized into something that sounded like a chorus of very irritated accountants. Honored adjudicators, we stand before you today to address the most dangerous threat to Confederation jurisprudence in recorded history. The defendant has weaponized interpretation itself. Elena sipped her tea and smiled. Weaponized interpretation. She rather liked that phrase. For 37 standard years, the Hive Unit continued, Professor Vasquez has systematically undermined the stability of our legal framework through what she terms adaptive jurisprudence. Her interpretations of Confederation law have resulted in the overturning of 463 precedents, the liberation of 17 entire species from debt bondage, and the complete restructuring of trade law across the Outer Rim. Terrible, Elena murmured into her teacup. Simply awful. Adjudicator Kethmore's compound eyes swiveled toward her. The defendant will refrain from commentary during opening statements. Of course, Your Honor. Wouldn't want to interrupt the prosecution's creative writing exercise. The Hive Unit's 12 faces displayed identical expressions of outrage. This casual dismissal of procedure perfectly illustrates the defendant's fundamental disregard for civilized order. She treats law as if it were some sort of living document rather than the immutable code that has maintained galactic stability for millennia. Elena leaned forward slightly. Quick question. Purely procedural, mind you. When you say immutable code, are you referring to the same legal framework that still contains provisions for the taxation of quantum sheep? Because I'm reasonably certain those went extinct about 6,000 years ago. The crystalline amphitheater fell silent. Several adjudicators began frantically accessing their legal databases. The quantum sheep provision is ceremonial, Hive Unit 779 said through gritted teeth. It represents the continuity of legal tradition. Ah, tradition. The dead hand of the past shaking hands with the confused brain of the present. Elena refilled her cup. Tell me, which tradition takes precedence when ceremonial quantum sheep law conflicts with the Rigelian Compact on species protection? Because I've got about 17 cases pending that hinge on exactly that question. Adjudicator Kethmore's antennae twitched in what might have been amusement or annoyance. The prosecution will continue with their opening statement. The Hive Unit's collective breathing pattern shifted to something resembling barely controlled fury. The defendant's methodology is chaos disguised as scholarship. She exploits ambiguities in legal text that were never intended to be ambiguous. She finds connections between statutes that were never meant to connect. She treats precedent as suggestion rather than commandment. Fascinating theory, Elena said. Quick follow-up. Who exactly decided what was intended in laws written by species that have been dead for 3,000 years? Did you hold a séance, or is this more of a divination situation? The intent is clear from the text itself. Is it, though? Because I've been reading Confederation law for 4 decades, and the only thing that's clear is that nobody who wrote it expected it to last this long. Half of these statutes reference governmental bodies that don't exist anymore. The other half assume technological limitations that were surpassed before humans even developed writing. The Hive Unit's voices rose in pitch. This is exactly the sort of destabilizing rhetoric that has infected legal proceedings across 17 sectors. The defendant treats fundamental jurisprudence as if it were some sort of intellectual puzzle to be solved rather than sacred truth to be preserved. Elena set down her teacup with a soft clink. Sacred truth. Right. So when the Altarian trade accords specify that all sentient beings have commercial rights, and a new species achieves sapience, we should just ignore them because the original drafters didn't specifically mention them by name. The Altarian Accords were drafted with known species in mind. Were they? Because the drafting committee's notes, which, incidentally, your people classified as historical curiosities until I subpoenaed them, explicitly state that they were trying to create flexible frameworks for future expansion. Their words, not mine. The crystalline amphitheater's acoustic properties meant that Elena's quiet voice carried to every corner of the vast space. The adjudicators were listening now, really listening, and the hive unit was beginning to look like 12 accountants who had just discovered their books didn't balance. The prosecution rests its opening statement, they said abruptly. Already? Elena asked. But you haven't even gotten to the part where you accuse me of corrupting the youth and denying the gods. I was looking forward to that bit. Chief Adjudicator Kethmore's mandibles clicked in what definitely sounded like amusement. The defense may present their opening statement. Elena stood, brushing imaginary dust from her robes. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll try to keep this brief. The prosecution has accused me of treating law as a living document rather than a mutable code. They're absolutely right. The question before this court is whether that's a crime or a cure. She paused, looking around the amphitheater at the assembled representatives of 4 to 7 different species. Because if law is truly immutable, then we're all just very expensive filing clerks, and this whole civilization is nothing more than an elaborate suicide note written in legalese. Elena walked to the center of the amphitheater, her footsteps echoing off the crystalline walls. She had discarded her tea service now, replacing it with a portable holographic projector that looked suspiciously like something cobbled together from spare parts. I'd like to present 3 cases to this distinguished court, she began, activating the device. 3 times when your immutable code nearly committed genocide through sheer bureaucratic inertia. The hologram flickered to life, displaying the seal of the Vegan Commerce Authority. Several adjudicators shifted uncomfortably. Case 1. The Silicate Collective versus the Confederation Banking Consortium, Standard Year 2387. The Silicates had just achieved warp capability and applied for membership in the Confederation. Standard procedure, right? Fill out Form 7742B, submit genetic samples, wait for approval. She gestured, and the hologram shifted to show microscopic images of crystalline structures. Except the silicates don't have DNA. They reproduce through quantum crystallization patterns. The banking consortium's computers couldn't process their application because there was no genetic template on file. The system rejected them automatically. Adjudicator Velthara, whose own species resembled walking gemstones, leaned forward. I remember this case. The matter was resolved through standard administrative channels. Was it? Elena's smile was sharp. Because I have the original case files right here. The silicates were denied basic citizenship rights for 4 to 7 years. 4 to 7 years of existing in legal limbo while bureaucrats argued over whether silicon-based life could technically be considered organic under subsection 12C of the Species Classification Act. The hologram now showed shipping records, trade agreements, and medical documentation. The sheer volume of data made several adjudicators' optical sensors flicker in distress. During those 4 to 7 years, the silicates couldn't own property, enter contracts, or even access emergency medical services. When the Andromedan pirates raided their outer colonies, they couldn't file for military protection because they weren't legally considered people. Hive Unit 779's collective voice rose in protest. The Classification Act serves an important function in maintaining order. Order. Elena's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. 17,000 silicates died in those raids. Children, poets, scientists, all because your order demanded that life conform to a checkbox on a form written by beings who thought carbon was the only element capable of supporting consciousness. She waved her hand, and the hologram shifted to show Elena herself, decades younger, standing in what appeared to be a smaller courtroom. I solved this case by citing the Fundamental Rights Declaration, subsection 1a. All conscious beings possess inherent dignity regardless of their substrate or origin. The prosecution argued that this was obviously meant to apply only to organic life. I pointed out that the declaration used the word substrate, which is a geology term. The drafters knew exactly what they were doing. Adjudicator Kethmore's antennae twitched. The silicates are now full members of the Confederation. They are. And it only took a human reading your own laws correctly to make it happen. Elena gestured again, and the hologram shifted to show a massive gas giant surrounded by orbital habitats. Case 2, the Ethereal Consensus versus the Confederation Environmental Protection Agency, Standard Year 2398. This time, the uncomfortable shifting came from the gaseous members of the court, whose transparent forms rippled with distress. The ethereals live in gas giant atmospheres. They are basically sentient weather patterns. Beautiful, complex, ancient. They'd been part of the Confederation for 3 centuries when the EPA suddenly decided that their reproductive method, which involves controlled atmospheric storms, violated the Clean Air Act. Elena's voice took on a tone of mock bureaucratic precision. Specifically, subsection 47J, which prohibits the intentional generation of atmospheric disturbances exceeding 2.3 on the Beaufort scale without proper environmental impact assessments. The ethereal adjudicator's form began to darken with what might have been anger or embarrassment. The EPA was merely following established protocols. The EPA was about to sterilize an entire species because nobody had bothered to exempt natural biological processes from industrial pollution standards. Elena's hologram now showed atmospheric readings, storm patterns, and what appeared to be EPA enforcement vessels preparing to intervene in an ethereal mating ritual. The Confederation was 3 days away from using weather modification satellites to suppress every storm in the ethereal system. 3 days from committing accidental genocide in the name of environmental protection. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the chamber. I saved them by cross-referencing the Clean Air Act with the biological preservation statutes. Turns out, there's an exemption for natural atmospheric phenomena essential to species survival. The EPA argued that ethereal reproduction was artificial because it involved conscious intent. I argued that consciousness doesn't negate biological necessity. A thinking storm is still a storm. The hologram shifted one final time, showing a massive space station orbiting a neutron star. Case 3, the Quantum Monks versus the Confederation Treasury, Standard Year 2401. The monks had achieved a state of consciousness that existed partially outside normal spacetime. They could perceive probability cascades, manipulate quantum uncertainty, and occasionally predict the future. Elena's smile turned predatory. The Treasury decided they were a tax evasion risk. The chamber erupted in various forms of alien laughter, clicking, and harmonic resonance. Even some of the adjudicators seemed amused. The Temporal Revenue Service argued that beings who could see across multiple timelines had an unfair advantage in financial markets. They demanded that the monks pay taxes on income they might theoretically earn in potential futures. Hive Unit 779's harmony faltered. Surely that's a reasonable interpretation of probability-based taxation. The monks were being billed for trades they hadn't made yet. In some cases, trades that would never happen. The TRS was demanding payment for theoretical profits in hypothetical markets. Elena's voice rose with incredulous amusement. They actually tried to audit a meditation session. The hologram showed Elena arguing before a panel of bewildered tax officials, gesturing at equations that seemed to twist space around themselves. I resolved this by invoking the Temporal Paradox Prevention Act, which prohibits any legal action that could create causality loops. If you tax someone for future income, you change the conditions that would generate that income. The TRS was literally trying to audit the laws of physics. Elena deactivated the hologram and faced the court directly. 3 cases. 3 times your immutable code nearly destroyed entire civilizations through rigid adherence to the letter of law while completely ignoring its spirit. In each case, the solution wasn't to break the law, it was to understand what the law was actually trying to accomplish. She paused, scanning the assembled adjudicators. The prosecution calls this destabilizing. I call it literacy. The amphitheater's crystalline walls began to shimmer and shift, transforming into a vast holographic display that stretched from floor to ceiling. Elena stood at the center as data streams flowed around her like luminous rivers, each thread representing a different aspect of Confederation jurisprudence. Those 3 cases were just the beginning, Elena said, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. What I'm about to show you is the result of 4 decades of what humans call due diligence and what everyone else apparently calls dangerous obsession. She gestured, and the display zoomed out to reveal the entire Confederation legal network, a massive interconnected web of statutes, precedents, and regulatory frameworks spanning hundreds of star systems. Behold, your legal system in its full glory. 12,000 years of accumulated wisdom, crafted by the finest minds of 4 to 7 different species. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. And it's completely, catastrophically broken. The Hive unit's collective harmony wavered. The defendant is clearly attempting to what? Tell the truth. Elena waved her hand, and red highlights began appearing throughout the network like a spreading infection. These are conflicts. Places where one law directly contradicts another. I count approximately 473,000 of them. Adjudicator Velthara's crystalline form brightened with alarm. That's impossible. The consistency protocols prevent direct contradictions. The consistency protocols check for contradictions within individual legal documents. They don't check for contradictions between documents written by different species at different times under different technological assumptions. Elena's voice took on a lecturing tone. The ethereal's atmospheric regulations conflict with the metalloid's mining rights. The quantum monk's temporal restrictions clash with the android's predictive commerce laws. The silicate's property concepts are incompatible with the gaseous collective's territorial definitions. The display shifted, showing overlapping jurisdictions that created a 3-dimensional maze of legal impossibilities. But the contradictions are just the surface problem. The real issue is systematic discrimination masquerading as neutral procedure. Elena pointed to a cluster of yellow highlights. These are laws that appear species neutral but effectively exclude entire classes of beings from basic rights. She zoomed in on a specific section. Take the Unified Sentience Testing Protocol. Seems fair, right? All species take the same test to prove consciousness. Except the test requires verbal communication, which excludes telepathic species. It assumes individual identity, which excludes hive minds. It measures temporal perception, which excludes beings who exist across multiple timelines simultaneously. The hive unit's 12 voices rose in unison. The testing protocol has been validated by centuries of use. Has it? Because I've been tracking the results, and there's a fascinating pattern. Elena gestured, and statistics began flowing across the display. Species that resemble the original test designers pass at a 97% rate. Species that don't resemble them pass at a 31% rate. Either consciousness is distributed along taxonomic lines, or your test is measuring cultural similarity rather than cognitive ability. Chief Adjudicator Kethmore's antennae had gone completely still. Are you suggesting that the Confederation has been systematically excluding qualified species from membership? I'm not suggesting it. I'm documenting it. Elena's voice hardened. And that's just the membership requirements. The economic frameworks are worse. The Confederation operates on a debt-based currency system that assumes species understand compound interest, which excludes cultures that evolved without mathematical concepts like infinity. The trade regulations require ownership of physical property, which excludes nomadic species. The employment laws assume individual wage labor, which excludes collective species. The display now showed economic data flowing like blood through the legal network, with vast sections highlighted in pulsing red. 17 species have been driven to economic extinction not through conquest or disaster, but through legal frameworks that made their survival impossible. They didn't lose wars, they lost to paperwork. Adjudicator Velthara's form was now flickering between frequencies. Even if your analysis is correct, the system has provided stability for millennia. Stability for whom? Elena's laugh was bitter. The same 47 species that wrote the original laws? The ones whose legal concepts became the template for everyone else? That's not stability, that's stagnation with a legal stamp of approval. She gestured again, and the display shifted to show a new network, one that pulsed with different colors and seemed to flow rather than remain static. This is what I've been building for the past 15 years. A legal framework based on adaptive interpretation rather than rigid precedent. Instead of forcing all species to conform to a single set of assumptions, it creates contextual frameworks that adjust based on the participants' cognitive and cultural parameters. The new network was smaller but far more complex, with connections that shifted and evolved as Elena demonstrated different scenarios. In this system, contracts between telepathic species don't require written documentation. Trade agreements with collective species acknowledge group ownership. Temporal regulations account for beings who experience time differently. It's not chaos, it's customization. Hive Unit 779's collective voice reached a pitch that suggested either panic or rage. What you're describing would invalidate every legal precedent in Confederation history. Would it? Or would it finally make those precedents serve their intended purpose? Elena's smile was triumphant. Because I've been implementing this framework for 5 years now, and the results speak for themselves. The display showed case after case where Elena's adaptive approach had resolved conflicts that traditional methods had deemed impossible. The cybernetic collective versus the biological purists. The quantum anarchists versus the temporal monarchists. The hive queens versus the individual supremacists. All resolved not through compromise or conquest, but through legal frameworks that acknowledge the fundamental legitimacy of different ways of existing. She paused, letting the weight of her revelation settle over the chamber. The prosecution is right about one thing. I have been systematically undermining the stability of Confederation jurisprudence. But what I've been building in its place isn't chaos, it's evolution. The question isn't whether the current system is broken. The question is whether you're brave enough to fix it. The holographic display began to fade, leaving Elena standing alone in the center of the amphitheater. Because with or without your permission, the galaxy is changing. New species are achieving consciousness. Old species are evolving beyond their original parameters. The choice isn't between stability and chaos, it's between adaptation and extinction. She looked directly at Chief Adjudicator Kethmore. And extinction, Your Honor, is remarkably stable. The silence that followed Elena's presentation stretched for exactly 4 to 7 seconds. She counted, before Chief Adjudicator Kethmore's mandibles began the ritual clicking that preceded formal deliberation. The other adjudicators joined in with their species-specific equivalents, harmonic resonance from the ethereals, crystalline chiming from Velthara, and what sounded suspiciously like muffled cursing from the Metaloid representative. The court will recess for deliberation, Kethmore announced, though his compound eyes never left Elena's face. We will reconvene in 6 standard hours. Elena nodded pleasantly and returned to her seat, where she began preparing another cup of tea as if she hadn't just proposed dismantling 12 millennia of galactic civilization. The other beings in the amphitheater filed out in various states of agitation, confusion, and what might charitably be called existential crisis. Hive Unit 779 lingered near the prosecution table, their 12 forms huddled together in what appeared to be furious consultation. Elena caught fragments of their harmony, unprecedented breach, civilization-ending precedent, and should have seen this coming. That last phrase made her smile. When the court reconvened, The adjudicators moved with the careful precision of beings who had spent 6 hours arguing about whether to save or abandon everything they'd ever believed in. Kethmore's announcement came without preamble. After extensive deliberation, this court finds the defendant guilty of systematic jurisprudential subversion, but recommends clemency based on demonstrated necessity of reform. The court hereby sentences Professor Vasquez to supervised implementation of her proposed legal framework within a limited test jurisdiction. Elena blinked slowly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Because it sounded like you just sentenced me to do exactly what I've been doing for the past 5 years, except now with official permission." "The test jurisdiction will be the Outer Rim territories," Velthara added, her crystalline form shimmering with what might have been embarrassment. "Sectors with minimal existing legal infrastructure." "Ah." Elena's smile widened. "The sectors where I've already implemented my framework and demonstrated its effectiveness. How convenient." Hive Unit 779's collective voice rose to a pitch that suggested mechanical distress. "This is not over. The defendant's methods remain fundamentally dangerous to civilized order." "Prosecutor," Elena interrupted gently, "might I ask how many of your constituent minds are currently connected to the Confederation legal database?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. The Hive Unit's harmony faltered. "All of them, naturally. Hive minds require constant legal synchronization to maintain collective decision-making protocols." "And how many of those protocols have been updated in the past standard year?" The silence stretched longer this time. Elena could practically hear the databases being queried, the cross-references being checked, the horrible realization dawning. 17,431 protocols, one of the Hive Unit's bodies whispered. All using interpretive frameworks developed by whom? By your adaptive jurisprudence methodologies." Elena's smile became positively radiant. "Congratulations, prosecutor. You've been thinking with my legal framework for the better part of a year. How does it feel to be part of the subversion?" The revelation rippled through the amphitheater like a shock wave. Elena watched with scientific interest as the assembled beings began checking their own legal systems, their own databases, their own fundamental assumptions about how law should function. "You see," she continued conversationally, "the beautiful thing about adaptive legal frameworks is that they spread naturally. When you encounter a legal problem that your traditional methods can't solve, you look for alternatives. When those alternatives work better than your original methods, you start using them more often. When they work consistently better, they become your new normal." She stood and began packing her tea service with the same methodical care she'd shown at the beginning of the trial. "I didn't need to overthrow your legal system. I just needed to demonstrate that mine worked better. The rest took care of itself." Chief Adjudicator Kethmore's antennae were twitching rapidly. "How many judicial systems have incorporated your methodologies?" "Oh, I stopped counting after the first 100 sectors. Legal evolution tends to accelerate once it reaches critical mass." Elena sealed her tea kit and shouldered her bag. "Though I should mention that the formal adoption rate has increased dramatically since this trial began." "Since this trial began?" "Well, yes. Nothing advertises the effectiveness of adaptive jurisprudence quite like watching it dismantle a prosecution in real time." Elena's expression was innocent. "I estimate that court transcripts of these proceedings will be required reading in law schools across at least 30 sectors by next semester." The amphitheater erupted in various forms of alien consternation. Elena waited patiently for the noise to subside. "If it's any consolation," she added, "your legal system isn't actually being destroyed. It's being upgraded. All the fundamental principles remain: justice, equity, protection of rights. The only thing that's changing is the recognition that different beings might need different approaches to achieve the same goals." Hive Unit 779 made a sound like grinding gears. "You've turned this entire trial into a demonstration project." "Have I? Or have I simply allowed your legal system to function as intended, as a method for determining truth through adversarial examination of evidence. Elena tilted her head thoughtfully. Because if you think about it, we've just conducted the most comprehensive peer review of Confederation jurisprudence in galactic history. She paused at the amphitheater's exit and looked back at the assembled adjudicators. The verdict you just rendered isn't a sentence. It's a recognition that evolution was already underway. You're not authorizing change, you're acknowledging reality. As she walked toward the exit, Elena reflected on the fundamental irony of the situation. The Confederation had taught her their law specifically to contain human unpredictability within manageable parameters. Instead, she had used that knowledge to make their entire legal framework more human, more adaptive, more contextual, more alive. They had tried to cage chaos and ended up democratizing it instead. The crystalline doors of the Nexus Supreme Court closed behind her with a sound like breaking glass, but Elena knew that what was really breaking was the illusion that law could ever be truly immutable. After all, the only constant in the universe was change itself, and that, as any human could tell you, was the most ancient legal precedent of all.